Ray Arata, welcome back to the podcast, man. I think I was saying this before we hit record. You are far and away the most regular guest. We should just have a regular segment. Mike and Ray talk about life and being white men in the world. But this is your fourth appearance on the show. I think the third in the last year. So it's good to have you back. And first of all, how are you doing these days?
Well, first of all, thank you, Mike. I feel honored. And I like the fact you use the word regular, not fancy, but regular. And that's just a testament to our relationship and both of our commitment to the work of what it means to be a conscious, heart-centered white male
Yes.
in the world today.
Well, and I'm excited to talk to you today because I mean, I know your Better Together conference is coming up in just a few weeks. And, the show's called We're All in This Together. And you and I've had some great conversations, not only here on the show, but just in life about allyship and togetherness and inclusion and belonging and all the things that are so important with the work that you do and your books and, the Better Man conference and movement that you've started. So maybe we can just start by talk to me a little bit about this conference. And for people listening, it's October 18th and 19th of 2023. If you're listening to this, obviously before that, you can participate. If it's afterwards, you can check out after the fact. But talk to me, Ray, a little bit about this particular conference, because I know you've been doing events and events like this for a number of years, but this one seems like it's got a little bit of a different focus.
Yeah, so I recognized at the end of last year that with some coaching from my coach that it was time to put down the mantle of the Better Man conference, and I was ready for it. And part of that was because after 16 conferences of putting attention and intention on men, I needed to give a pause and to see what would come back. And what came back from my dear friend and colleague Jennifer Brown of Jennifer Brown Consulting was this idea of the Better Together conference. And when you think about Better Together, it's the end game.
Right.
Right. And what I realized in witnessing all the DEI backlash and all the attention on men, that despite my best intentions of putting attention on men without shame or blame, and I would do it all over again, I felt that it was time to refocus, recontextualize. Instead of this being about DEI, it's about inclusive leadership.
Yes.
That includes men. And we'll talk a little bit later about the 5 states of men and how some men don't feel included. But I talked to Jennifer and I said, what I think we should do is we should externally model what we want DEI departments and leadership development departments to do, and that is to partner. Right. So on its face, as a broad-based diversity shop that recognizes the critical importance of engaging men in those efforts, now you've got 2 separate entities coming together for everyone to see. And it's about allyship and it's about leadership. So allyship is really more of that personal journey,
right,
for everybody, anyone seeking to be an ally to anyone. And inclusive leadership includes one's own personal allyship journey, but with it comes responsibility.
Yeah.
So that's why we ended up doing it. And so we've set up 2 days. Let's build up the muscle. Let's refine some of our skills in day one with a series of conversations. And that's that key word. That's my context for the year, because conversation seems to be a lost art.
Yeah.
And it seems in our country and around the world that it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to be in conversation, and noticeably absent from those conversations are men. So with that said, we're trying to bring all of that together so that when day 2 comes, it's going to be more of a workshop feel. So we're going to be putting people into breakouts, out of breakouts, into breakouts, out of breakouts, so that they can develop their diversity story, so that they can learn how to listen to other people's story, so that at the end of the day, their ability to connect with other people and to be an ally in leadership is going to come from the heart.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, Jennifer's been on the show. I think you introduced me to her a number of years ago, and she does fantastic work, her books and her consulting. And I know you all partner a lot. So I love that you're doing the conference together. because there's so many things that you just said, I think, that are important. I want to ask you something about allyship, because I was at an event earlier this week and we had someone present on DEI, and we were talking about different aspects of this. And she said something, the woman presenting said something really interesting that I hadn't heard, but it resonated with me. And she said, you know, you don't get to declare yourself as an ally. You get to show up as an ally, and the people you are being an ally to will tell you if you're actually an ally or not. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, because, in my back of my mind, I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm an ally. I want a t-shirt. You know what I mean? There was a part of my own little ego, but I was like, oh, that's an interesting way to think about it or to frame it. I'm just curious your thoughts on that specifically, or just allyship in general.
So you almost stepped into the dog do. So in my work, the golden rule is you never refer to yourself as an ally. So guess what I refer to myself as?
What?
You ready? Forever an ally in training.
Ah, I like that.
I can refer to myself as such. So all of my friends who herald from marginalized groups, they'll tell me I'm an ally.
Yes.
Worst case scenario or best case scenario is seek to understand what it means to be an ally and be it and do it, and they'll call you an ally.
Right. Well, and I think as you think about that, Ray, too, just in life in general, it's like if you're an ally in training, if your desire intention is to be an ally, I mean, it's kind of like, look, you and I've had so many conversations about being husbands and being fathers. I mean, at the end of the day, it's really like, I can think I'm a good husband, I can think I'm a good father, but it's my wife and my children that really get to decide that. Right. I mean,
Right,
ultimately, and again, I think it goes back to, at some level, being at peace with ourselves and knowing where we're coming from and where our intention is. But like, and you teach a lot in your work, there's intention and then there's impact. And
right.
sometimes with good intention, we have negative impact that we don't even realize. And that's part of the ally in training. It's like, oh, I'm always
Exactly.
learning, I'm always growing. I'm going to take the feedback from the people that I really am attempting to be in support of, and actually listen to what they're saying, what they're wanting and needing, and what I'm doing that may be working and may not be working necessarily. Right.
That's absolutely correct. And, for you and I who identify as white, cisgendered, heterosexual males, there's a spotlight currently that's on white males. And one of the things I'm seeking to do is to be more inclusive of anybody that identifies as a white male without any shame or blame. So that
Right.
means for me, how do I meet the guys from the far right
Mm-hmm.
where they are
Right.
without judging them? Now
Yep.
that needs to be a two-way street. Or the men who are hardline Christian. I mean, I
Right.
was Catholic growing up. I became Christian, but now it's I'm not the prototypical Christian.
Right.
I'm pro-choice.
Yep.
Right there, I said it. So it's like that. Some people might say, "Well, that then you're not Christian." So
Right.
it's work in progress. You and I have a responsibility, and for the rest of my days, I want to be the model, and I want to galvanize men who look like me, who have power, position, privilege, influence, to utilize what they have to shift the narrative.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you touched on it a minute ago, and I want to go deeper into it, this DEI backlash. Because here's what I see in my work as I'm traveling around and talking to so many different leaders and teams and a lot of these big corporations. I mean, a lot of the same companies you're partnering with as well, Ray. But, without going too far into it, I mean, historically, just over the last, let's say, I don't know, 7, 8 years, I feel like something really changed when Donald Trump got elected, in terms of, politically things changed, and the shock of that. And then all that started to come about sort of societally. I mean, you and I live here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Obviously, the politics of this region are different than other parts of the country. But it seemed to me like I don't remember politics and political issues and social issues being so front and center and so everywhere like they were in those first few years of the Trump presidency. And then we had sort of a fever pitch of things around the Me Too movement,
Right.
and Time's Up. And, the Black Lives Matter movement had started prior to that, when Barack Obama was still president, but it started, there was more momentum around some of that. And a lot of people that I knew, yourself included, Jennifer Brown and others in the DEI space, there was a lot of energy and attention, and like, hey, we need to do more. Companies are being sort of challenged to, you got to speak up, you got to say something, you got to, then COVID hits.
Yeah.
And I remember for the first few months after COVID, talking to you, talking to Jennifer, talking to others, and there was a general sense of like, oh no, what's going to happen economically? And now everyone's so obsessed with the pandemic. DEI sort of has fallen down the list of important topics. And now all this momentum and all this energy and all this focus has kind of gone away. Well, then George Floyd is murdered and things explode in the summer of 2020, and everything's happening socially and culturally and COVID and all of it. And it was like, it sort of flipped in that every company on the planet seemed like, if they didn't already have a chief diversity officer, they hired one. There was all of this emphasis and money and resource and energy put into that. And now here we are a few years later, there's a different president in the White House. We've come out of the pandemic. The pandemic ended up being incredibly gnarly and divisive in a way that I don't think any of us, myself included, thought it was going to be. I actually naively thought at the beginning, hey, maybe this is the thing that's going to bring us together. And now here we are in the fall of 2023. And there's a lot of energy that I feel and hear and pushback like, hey, I'm tired of talking about this. And, so anyway, that's my long soliloquy on sort of the way that I've seen it. And it's a big generalization and oversimplification. But you who are doing this work on a day-to-day basis, like, how do you see sort of where we are right now in that evolution and kind of what's going on from the people that you're talking to and seeing out there in the world?
So the way you pose that has me want to say that those with privilege use COVID as an excuse.
Yeah.
To not deal with it. I mean, white folk can turn off the news, things the way they are, because it's hard.
Yes.
It's hard to continue pushing the envelope for change. And this old habits die hard. And so in the end, in the fall last year, I wrote a couple of blogs on my Better Man Conference website, and I encouraged leaders, don't abdicate, advocate.
Right. That's what you and I were talking about when we talked last fall. That's right.
Yeah. And so here we are. So my decision is, no matter what's going on out in the universe, one of the things I have done is I've recontextualized my approach. And that's, instead of this being about DEI, it's about inclusive leadership.
Yes.
And for someone like me, I have to be willing to try everything and anything until it goes click.
Yeah.
Because leaders, white male or others, they want to lead and they have responsibility. And if they can understand that comprehending the lived experiences of other people is important on their journey of being an inclusive leader, and then they ask themselves, how do I want to be experienced by other people? Something happens where they want to be more human. And if I'm a white male leader and I'm not shamed and I'm not vilifying myself for being white or feeling guilty, and I see these wonderful human beings that identify differently, I have an opportunity to create psychological safety and encourage them to bring their whole selves to work. I mean, how many titles of your book did I get in that? Your books, because they can be better together. There it is. I think I got 3 books.
There we go.
Because you don't want to be yourself because everyone else is taking it. That's 4.
We'll get them all. We just got to focus on good stuff, Ray. We're good.
So there you go. So that's I'm choosing to proceed as if the DI backlash is noise. Okay, has my business suffered? Absolutely. Are things going to change? Well, damn straight, because I intend to keep bringing the pressure. Right. Because I'm not going to just turn off my white male privileges and say the hell with it because it's too hard. I'm not going to do that.
Well, and you know what's interesting? So this woman, gosh, her name is escaping me. She has a long last name. She went by Dr. E, is the one who was speaking at this event earlier this week. Yeah. And it was an event for my publisher, but she said something interesting as well about, she was talking about backlash and terms, white privilege, white supremacy. And she goes, look, these things exist and these things are important to talk about. Yeah. The problem is that once I say the word white supremacy, when I say those words, or even white privilege in this room, she's like, those of you who are white, especially those of you white men, I've now learned you are going to stop listening to me or have some internal emotional reaction to that that's going to have you then put up a wall. And she said, so what I'm trying to figure out how to do, she was talking about herself in my own work, is without watering it down or sugarcoating it, come up with different language for these types of things, in the same way that we're challenging everybody to come up with language or be mindful of language that we're using and then changing because it's offensive or we don't even think about it. There's all these figures of speech and sayings that we've all said for years, and then you stop and go, wait a minute, what does that mean? Oh, that's actually offensive. So we change the words. And, people get upset about, well, now we're being the language police, but it's important. Words matter. And so she said, instead of white privilege, what she has been saying is automatic advantage. And she
That's
said, like,
better.
she says, when I say to people, let me try to explain automatic advantage. She said, do you think that Bill Gates's children were born with different advantages, say, than your children were? And everyone in the room goes, yes, of course, right? They have automatic advantage because of their father and who he is and what he did and what he does. And right. Everybody understands that. And so when she said that, I was just like, again, it's like being creative. And to the point, you talk a lot about this, Ray, like we don't want all of this work to be centered around the fragility of guys like me and you.
Yeah.
But at some level, if the structure is still in place that it's white men, it's cisgendered heterosexual white men who have power, the conversation, and this is what I've always loved about you and your work and the focus of it, the conversation that you're having with men in general, and specifically white men, is super important, because whether we call it allyship or not, or whether we can call ourselves allies or not, like that's what we're attempting to do, is get people in an allied, inclusive conversation about how do we make this better for everybody, right?
Glad you shared that, the woman who you saw speak, because it brings to mind. I was talking yesterday to my dear friend Michael Pritchard, who's an anti-bully activist, former stand-up comedian. For
Amazing
those
guy.
that know him, and he said to me, "Ray, I've learned to speak blue collarese,"
Yes.
and I'm like, "Michael, I love that." Because when we did a facilitated conversation book event at the Book Passage a couple of weeks ago, I had him do it with me because he loses the lingo.
Yep.
His words aren't triggering,
Right.
and it doesn't boil it down, or
Yep.
it doesn't water it down. It's
Yep.
just he's learned to find the language. So that's what I'm looking to do. I'm not going to shy away from the hard conversations, or
Right.
as you say, the sweaty palm conversations.
Yep.
Um, and so it's incumbent upon this woman that you saw, as well
Mhm.
as myself, to find the right language. Like, part of my job is to trigger people, but
Right.
it's trigger them into waking up, trigger
Yes.
them into understand what's going on for them, not triggering them into shutdown, because that doesn't do anybody any good.
No, you're absolutely right. Well, and I had another insight, Ray, this last week when we saw this woman speak. She had us do an exercise, simple exercise, but it was really powerful. She had these handouts that had just a bunch of different aspects of our identity.
Yeah.
Um, right. And she basically said, and it was our race and our gender and our orientation and our socioeconomics, but it went to things like, spirituality, and it went to all these different levels to, like, political events and different things happening. I mean, it was all these different layers of being human. And she said, what I'd like for you to do is pick the three most important to you on this list that you identify with, that would be important, that if you didn't have these to identify with, it would be painful for you, or it would be hard. I mean, there were things on there like friends and family. And so as I'm looking at this list, I mean, it was hard with an option of 20-25 things to pick the top three, but I picked my three, and then the guy next to me picked his three, and people were picking on the little worksheet.
Yeah.
And then she had a couple people share, and one man shared, and he happened to be a member of the LGBTQ community, and that was one of the things that he picked amongst others. And then there was a black woman in the group across the way who she said something, and I looked at whether I should have or not. The woman sitting next to me had picked the fact that she was female, even though she happened to be white. And then when I paired up with the guy who was sitting next to me, who, like me, was white and heterosexual and cisgendered and also American, and we both comment on the fact that we didn't pick being male or being white. Like, we didn't pick our gender or our race as any of the three most important things. But listening to the two people who spoke, and then the woman who was sitting next to me, the fact that they had all picked their gender and or their race or their orientation, what I said was like, wow, that's another layer of me to realize the sacredness and the significance of your race and your gender and your orientation when you don't look like me and you. It's not everybody, and I can't generalize for everybody, but the reality is, walking through the world, if you and I were female, or if I were gay, or you were black, or whatever it was, like, I would imagine that would be a bigger part of our identity. Like, my maleness and my whiteness isn't a huge part of my identity because of my privilege, and I don't have to think about it. I think about it maybe more than other people do who look like me, and you and I having these conversations. But in general, as I walk through the world, I'm not consciously thinking I'm white, I'm heterosexual, I'm male, I'm American. I mean, I'm just like,
That's why
I'm,
this work is so important. So the word that comes to mind is gratitude.
yeah.
So can I recognize that I have all these automatic advantages that totally changes my experience on the planet?
Right. And then the other piece back to relating to people who maybe, quote unquote, don't get it, or I had more empathy, because when people say, why is it always about race? Why is it always about gender? Why is it like, instead of thinking, well, that person's out of touch, or that person's insensitive, or that person's uneducated, or whatever judgment we have, it's like, oh no, that person doesn't have the lived experience of these things being as significant and important as someone else who has a different lived experience. So while we might debate, discuss, even potentially get into an argument, there's also a place of, can you have some empathy and compassion, right? It's like, again, let's say you don't have children. Your world is oriented around, it's hard to have the same perspective as someone who has children. Let's say you have a child who has special needs,
Right.
right? Or a child who goes through a crisis. You and I've talked enough about both our kids to, like, when one of your kids is going through something hard, or one of my kids is, of course, I'm going to see the world through the lens of, I have a kid who's struggling with this particular issue. People who don't have a kid struggling with that particular issue aren't going to understand the same things that I do. It doesn't make me better. It just makes, like, that's my worldview. That's my perspective. I'm super sensitive to that thing because it's happening in my own house. And that's where I feel like, Ray, so much of your focus on better together and moving from me to we is super important, but it's really challenging for us to get outside of our own personal experience. Why do you think that is?
Uh, um, personally, I believe personal growth, not to be confused with the word woke,
Mm,
is under supported, underemphasized. And usually, what happens as part of the human condition is we go through a wake up call in life, usually self generated.
right.
We are at the affect of the results of our actions, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's a divorce or a job loss or feeling isolated. And it's hard for people to choose to look inside at themselves and ask them the question, what did I have to do with this?
Right.
So even the person that's saying, why does this always have to be race? When I hear that question, I'm like, we always ask the why question from a place of ego. It's the wrong question to ask. So what's that tell me about that person?
Mm,
They're personalizing, or they aren't yet in touch with what's true about them because they feel like it's a personal affront
right.
to them.
Right.
So imagine if I could be in that room and I would invite everybody to take a huge breath
Mm.
and then to take another breath and maybe even to take one more and to be open to the possibility that there are other human beings in the room, and for a moment put aside your whatever you're being put in touch with, or even better yet, just to acknowledge it but not let that define you. And can you move into your heart and get curious about the other human beings
Right.
without thinking there's anything wrong with you? I personally believe that if we're able to slow down and return to our humanity, anything's possible.
Yeah.
Anything's possible, and that's a lost art. That's why I want to. I'm going down the path of doing a docu series because I want
Right.
to. I want to chronicle this. I want to choose abortion and pick people from different sides of the aisles. I want to choose guns. I want to
Yep.
choose red state, blue state,
Right.
capitalism, homelessness. I want to look at all these topics and lack of a better way of saying this, drop a love bomb in the
Yeah.
middle, melt the polarization. You know,
Yeah. Well, and it does seem like, You mentioned wokeness. It's so interesting to me again, and not to get too deep into the politics of it or the right versus left thing. It does seem like there is what I've experienced over the years, just in terms of the political divide in this country. I think I've shared this before on the show, so people listening will remember this. But I heard Brene Brown and Mark Maron on a podcast a number of years ago, and they said something about the political right and the political left in this country, that the mantra on the political right is like never apologize, and the mantra on the political left is never forgive, which I kind of thought was like oversimplified, but pretty spot on. But there does seem to be this thing that the political right does in the US is take terms and words and weaponize them like
Nice.
positive terms. I mean, even the word liberal has been weaponized in a way that's made to think weak and soft and bad, and right. So like
Yeah.
liberals change that word to progressive.
Yeah.
But woke, when you think of like the essence of the word woke, people started saying stay woke as a way of like stay awake, talk about what's going on, don't fall asleep, don't go back into like there's a lot happening, we got to pay attention, right? But now wokeness has turned into anything and everything that you don't have to really look at the issue. You can just say, oh, that's wokeness. Or the other thing that I find that's similar is this notion and this obsession with cancel culture. And it's not that I don't think cancel culture exists. It's not that I don't have issues with it, but now everything and everyone seems to be talking about this fear of cancel culture. And I'm like, wait a second, like who's actually getting canceled? Are they really getting canceled? And what does that mean? And what is that? But there's underneath it a genuine fear that I hear from a lot of people, particularly a lot of men, particularly a lot of white men, that they're afraid to say and do the wrong thing, and that it could have negative ramifications on them in a way that, like, I said this thing, I did this thing, or I said this thing 20 years ago and someone found it and posted it and shared it, or I wrote whatever it is. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that specifically, and like how you address this fear around cancel culture.
So I'll quote Jimmy Carter, and he was the one that said, "Silence is violence."
Mm,
And I want to acknowledge the fear that these men may feel,
yep.
fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. And I have both a message to them and to the message to those that are behind the curtain attempting to cancel.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the message to the people behind the curtain seeking to cancel is wait. Humanity reigns.
Mm-hmm.
Forgiveness, provided you see some elements of ownership and responsibility.
Right.
Let's figure that one out. Okay.
Right.
Now, specifically to white men, um, I talk about white male fragility and white male ability, and at the book event that I mentioned earlier,
Right.
there was a instance in the room where a woman of color felt safe enough to share with everybody. She worked for a local personal growth entity, and she was quote unquote the only woman of color there.
Mm-hmm.
And she shared that there was this one instance after 6 years of being the token person of color at the affect of a white male that she could no longer hold her tongue. And she basically let him have it cleanly, but with compassion. Okay. And she knew the next day because he was starting to be a bully to somebody else. So she spoke up. So the next day she knew he was coming for her.
Mm-hmm.
And she looked at him and said, "Stop. You've gotten victories at my expense for 6 years. I want to win at your expense for one day."
Mm.
And he started to cry. And then he asked for a hug. And she talked about this 6'4" white male and his fragility.
Mm-hmm.
And for most of the people in the room, they really didn't understand that. But so I said to myself, what am I going to say to the rest of the room? And so what I said to the rest of the room was, I was at another event where It was the event was in Oakland. White women and black women coming together, and there were 6 men in the room, of which there was only one white guy. And you're looking at him. It was me. I didn't even realize it. And the woman in front of me of color said, "I'm going to keep doing this work, and I'm willing to take the hits." And when she said that, I got sad and I got angry. And the woman of color who was facilitating must have saw what was going on with my face, and she looked over and she said, "Would you like to say something?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." I said, when the woman in front of me said that, I was angry and I was sad. And I'm realizing now in this moment that as a white male, it's people that look like me that need to be taking the hits. Now, let me talk about what I mean by taking the hits. If I'm going to be kicked out of the boys club by the white guys, or they're going to say stuff to me, right? My life's not threatened.
Right.
They're not going to take my job away.
Right.
So if I can be cognizant that there's even a distinction around my privilege as a white male, maybe I can lean into this and take a little bit more responsibility. So my message to the men is, you know, you want to be a better guy, better leader. And if you mess up, fess up, clean it up, and keep going.
Right.
And don't stay on the sidelines for fear of saying or doing the wrong thing.
Right.
And so the people over there who have been pulling the canceled levers, give it a rest. Be open to the possibility, because there's going to be one day when you're going to screw up.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and yeah, definitely. And I feel like this notion of canceling is different than, I think accountability is important. I think calling people out on stuff, holding people to a standard, it's the Maya Angelou, when we know better, we do better. But part of how we learn how to know better is people let us know. And that doesn't take us off the hook from having to be responsible and aware. But there's no way. I mean, I say oftentimes, oh, I can't keep up with all the language and the terms and the this and what offends people and doesn't. And I was like, look, you don't have to manage everybody's feelings and what might offend them. Just be open. Just pay attention. It's not that hard to pay attention. And again, to your point, sometimes we mess up on purpose, or at least more deliberately. And then it's like, oh my gosh, I'm embarrassed I did that. Let me go. Sometimes we quote unquote mess up and have no idea. We're like confused as to what. And again, I often say, I mean, any man, any, cisgendered heterosexual man knows, if you've ever been in a relationship with a woman, that's probably happened so many times in your life that you're like, what did I do? What I have, I inadvertently hurt this person who I love and care about. I didn't mean to, but I still did. It's just like sometimes, like Michelle, my wife and I have been together for almost 25 years. Like there's been a few times in our relationship I have inadvertently physically harmed her. Like I've bumped into her, I've knocked her down. You know what I mean? Not because but just like I stepped on her foot. I mean, it just being around another human being. It's like, oh my gosh, I did not mean to do that. I'm so sorry. What can I do? You know what I mean? And again, again, in the public sphere, in our professional lives, and look, you and I both know this. I mean, Robin DiAngelo wrote about this in White Fragility. It's like the accusation of racism to many white people is worse than actual racism. Like, sure. How dare you call me racist? I'm not racist, right? As opposed to, wait a second, we could argue that one way or the other, but there's actual racism happening to real people that's really impacting their lives in a significant way, personally and systematically. But there seems to be a bigger offense taken in a lot of cases by even the accusation of that.
Yeah. The woman you mentioned who's learning the effect of her language, and how I'm learning blue collarese. There's something that you said, like when you said you did something, you didn't mean it. One of the things I talk about a lot is intention versus impact.
Yep.
This is another instance of the me versus the we. So if I said something and it offended you, what I don't want to say is I didn't mean it, because now I'm centering my intention which is irrelevant for the moment, because you're the one at impact.
Right.
So if you could hit rewind on what you said and go back and say, tell me more.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry that what I said or didn't say, did or didn't do, made you feel sad.
Right.
Sorry. Say the S word. Sorry.
Yep.
And then say, you know what? Thank you. I'm going to go take a look at this, go to my men's group or whatever, talk to somebody, so I do this less.
Right.
That's what I teach, and that's what I seek to do myself.
Well, and I'm curious, as we're talking about this, though, something just popped up in my mind that I've been wrestling with. On the one hand, as we have all these conversations, to me, what I'm attempting to do myself and what I'm wanting, if I can in any way, and to inspire in others, is like, let's be more aware, let's be more mindful, let's be more the healthy side of sensitive, right? And at the same time, paradoxically, there does seem to be an issue that we're running into, not just with white men, although you and I both know this is true, but I do actually think collectively there is a certain fragility. I see this in our kids. I see this with lots of people, even around these conversations. Like there's a fear of upsetting and offending people that I think sometimes is super problematic. So it's like, how can we paradoxically go into this and say, I want to, and I would like to inspire others to be as sensitive and aware and mindful as possible of all of this, and at the same time not so damn fragile that we can't talk about this stuff, and we can, you know what I mean? Because in some ways I think it gets in the way, and it can almost seem like we're talking out of both sides of our mouth, like let's be more mindful, more sensitive, more aware, but let's not be so fragile. But then wait a minute, where's the lane to engage? Because this to me gets into some of your states of men, in the sense of like, I see a lot of really well-intentioned men who are either scared or confused or just like, I don't know what to do, what to say, how to engage. And so, as you and I both know, what do they do? What do we often do? Opt out because we can.
Right. So there's a lot in there, Mike, and so there's this notion, and it's one of my mantras, about meeting them where they are. So
Right.
that's first and foremost with men, but for all intents and purposes, you're talking about everybody afraid to say or do the wrong thing.
Right.
And so people like me who have a platform, I take on the responsibility to create forums
Right.
of conversation. And in meeting those, whoever they are, wherever they are, it's not where I believe they should be. It's where they are. And so when I did that event a couple of weeks ago, 70% of the people were non-corporate, good human beings, a Marin crowd, and they showed up. There was, 20 to 30% people of color, and the rest were white Marin people. But
Right.
guess what? They wanted to learn. Might there have been a fair amount of naivete in the room? Absolutely. Are we going to
Right.
shame them for that? No. We're going to continue to educate and remind them of things like keep learning. Forgiveness is a good thing. Bring your humanity back into the equation, right? So it's an effort.
Yeah.
It takes long. It takes a while, and otherwise, if you think about it, people are worried about what other people think,
Right.
right? And someone told me a long time ago, people are far less thinking about you than you think they are. So
Totally.
that's just kind of an ego-driven thing that, oh, who I am and who I'm not is based upon what other people think.
Right.
Reclaim the power of who you are, seek to be a better human being, educate yourself, and you can push through that fear. And remember, you're human. So
Right.
if you make a mistake, if you fess up, or
Mm-hmm.
if you mess up, fess up, clean it up, and show up. Keep
Yeah.
going.
Yeah. Well, I mean, show up, obviously your great book, Showing Up, that came out last year. Um, Talk to me a bit. I mean, we've alluded to it a couple of times, but remind me again what those different 5 states of men are and how that relates to what we're talking about here.
Sure. So, these 5 states of men that I created came about as a result of me talking to hundreds and hundreds of men and DEI colleagues who were attempting to engage the men in their organizations. So these 5 states arose. So the first state is there's a group of men that feel threatened that DEI will deny them their job. Now the operative word is there, in that they believe that it's their job. That's their unexamined privilege, that they have a
Right.
God-given right to their job. And Michael Kimmel once said, privilege is invisible to those who have it.
Right.
That's the same group of guys that are saying all this attention on white men is a distraction. Once again, that's their unexamined privilege. And the way we meet those men where they are is we acknowledge their feelings, but then we educate them as to the distinction between earned and unearned privilege. And then we leave it up to them. If the light bulb clicks, then they're going to shift. That's the first group.
Okay.
Next group are the ones that feel excluded. These are the men that say, I don't feel included in all this. You have a business resource or employee resource group my company that is for women, for LGBTQ plus, people of color, Latin, but what about me?
Right.
Now, I'm not so worried about that group because in that temporary pain of exclusion, they can be shifted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The biggest group are the ones that are afraid to say or do the wrong thing, so they do nothing. I encourage them to feel into the fear. Don't pay attention to the story that you want to write as a result of the fear, and ask yourself, what's the story you want to write? Do you want to be a good person? Do you want to be an ally? Can you be a human knowing that you might make a mistake? Then keep going. Then there's another group, the ones that are unaware. They are actually not unaware, uncertain. They want to do something, but they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And the last group, very small group, are the ones that are allies in training. Those are the ones, and they're already doing stuff. So people who herald from different groups are already saying that these guys are allies.
Right.
So I share all these states, and a lot of time when I do a keynote, it's for the men to self-identify. And usually what men will do is, and the data's out there that shows this, they think they're further along than they actually are.
Right.
I say, guys, be honest. And
Yep.
then I ask everybody else in the crowd, what group do you most often encounter of men? And usually there's a difference
Mm. Most often encounter like
in
who
their
they
day to day at work.
interact. Right.
Do you encounter allies in training? Do you encounter men who feel threatened? Do you encounter men who feel afraid? Things of that nature. Yeah.
Well, and as I think about that, and I remember reading this in your book too and talking to you about it before, I mean, I feel like I can relate to all five of those categories in some
Yeah.
ways, right? And some more than others, clearly. But I also feel like, how do we create environments where we can talk about this honestly? Because, even though all of the things that I know, I mean, one thing that comes up for me, because I don't spend a lot of time feeling threatened or worried that like somehow there's some opportunities going to be missed because I'm white. And you know what I mean? I'm more aware these days of the advantage of it. And there are moments, look, Ray, and doing what you and I do for a living, like I've literally had conversations in the last 5 years, like, look, Mike, we wanted to book you for this thing, but we can't have another white guy. Right. And again, there's a part of me in the back of my mind that's like, okay, I totally get it. I don't take it personally. For years and years and years, that wasn't even part of the conversation. There were a whole bunch of women and people of color that weren't even considered for these things. And then there's like an insecure, scared part of me that's like, well, if that keeps happening over time, that could be a problem. Or this little whiny voice that says to me for, hundreds of years, especially in this country, it's been the biggest privilege possible to be me. Now it seems like there are certain situations where maybe it's not as much. And again, I don't talk about it out loud. I'm not whining and complaining about it, but when that comes up sometimes, like I don't exactly know what to do with it, what to say about it, because if I hear someone else say that, if you said that to me earnestly, I mean, if we're having a really deep conversation, I get it. But if I just heard someone say that in general, or I hear my sort of speaker friends complaining about it, I'd be the first to jump in and be like, hey, listen, do you understand? And I would get all preachy about like the whole historical, why this is and blah, blah, whatever. But yeah, I mean, there are moments where it'll hit me in a way and I'm like, damn,
It begs a bigger question, Mike.
Yes.
Right? And the bigger question is and this is my question for you to ask yourself internally. In recognition of all my privileges as a white man, am I using all of them for the sake of everybody else, which would be scary as all hell? Because imagine if you changed your tune or you brought into the equation um, your topics, and you right out of the bat you owned a lot of this stuff. Maybe you do already, but the reason I'm telling you this is what's happening with me is I'm being chosen to talk because I'm the white guy
Mm-hmm.
talks about this stuff.
Right. Right.
And right now, do I want to say the tide's turning? I think the tide is evolving where some companies and organizations are ready to have a white cisgendered male to come in and talk about, to be the model for.
Totally.
So it's a it's a dichotomy in terms of the experience you're having.
Well, it is. And in some ways, I mean, look, for you specifically with what you do
Yeah.
and what you talk about, I mean, you could look at it like, on the one hand, there's a token nature to it, but there's also a practical nature to it. I mean, and I've said it, my work isn't specifically in the DEI space, although, as you know, I mean, I do talk about this and it's part of what I talk about. And I think it's important. And I've learned over the last, especially 5 or 6 years, like there are certain situations where if people that look like me and you aren't talking about this, it's either not going to get brought up, or if it does get brought up, it's not going to get listened to by the other folks who look like us in a certain way. That
Right.
said, if we take it out deeper, and again, most people listening to us are not necessarily speakers and authors, and definitely not specifically in the DEI space. But I do think that what this gets to on a human level, at least for me, it's about scarcity. It's about fear. And part of the conversation around privilege or around advantage or whatever is that most people that I talk to,
Yeah.
irrespective of their race or their gender or their orientation, aren't living in a state of like, I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. My family's good. We have enough resource. We're all, you know what I mean? From that standpoint of just like, think of where you and I live in the country. Like, it's
Right.
friggin' expensive to live here, right? And
Yes.
even if you live in a part of the country that's less expensive, like most people are feeling a certain amount of economic pressure on top of the real world uncertainty that we've all been living through over the last couple of years. And so the reality, when we think about talking to men about these issues, as important as they are, because for a lot of people who look like me and you, this isn't day-to-day life and death stuff. That's why it's lower down the priority list on Maslow's hierarchy for certain people. And they're like, listen, not only is this less important to me, it makes me feel bad. I don't want to talk about this. I want to go and like feed my family and like have some fun. And do you know what I mean? And I don't mean to minimize it, but I think it hits on some really important sort of basic human levels that if we don't acknowledge, make the conversation that much more difficult. And then we're living in our little echo chambers like we are on social media anyway.
Yeah, I mean that's a reality that only those individuals can decide if they want to stay in that place. I gently attempt to help them look around in their communities at their companies, and to your point in the beginning of our conversation, to have gratitude for
Yes.
all the advantages we have, and to gently put to them, how do you want to be experienced by other people? It's not about taking on another job,
Right.
it's about being more human. And there are some people who will step more into this and do more, and there's some people who will do less.
Yeah.
And so, and there are people like me and you that are going to keep pushing.
Yeah. For sure. Well, listen, Ray, I know we're just about out of time. What I do want to talk about briefly before we wrap up is the conference next week. I mean, as this interview posts, the conference will be coming up next week. Again, I mentioned at the beginning, it's the Better Together conference. It's October 18th and 19th. It's a virtual conference. So
Correct.
talk to me a bit about, for people, like, who's the conference for specifically, and what will people get from it if they choose to, register and engage?
So this year, the conference is for anyone seeking to be an ally to anyone, either and in a leadership capacity. We're going to skill build around allyship on day one, and day two, we're going to have more of a workshop feel where we be using breakouts. We chose virtual only because of the current DEI environment. Budgets are cut. We wanted to um, make access easier. Companies don't have budgets for traveling to conferences. And for your listeners, we'll offer a 15% discount for them to sign up. And so, what I can promise is that by showing up at day one, you'll witness a series of conversations and you'll get some skills further developed around allyship. And then on day two, we're going to really focus on every person's individual diversity story,
Mm,
so that you can understand your story, listen to other people's stories, and build relationship with your team members and colleagues. It's
yeah.
very important. So that's what's gonna happen on day two.
That's great. That's great. So for everybody listening, I'll mention this in the close of the show as well, but there's a link in the show notes where you can click to go and register for the conference. It's at bettermanconference.com, right, Ray? And is there a promo code, or will we just have a special link that folks will get the 15% off?
All I'll arrange for that so that you can let your listeners know when you
Okay.
post.
Great. When we post this, I'll put that in the conclusion here of the episode, so you'll have that. So just go to that link. You can sign up for the conference, which is next week, October 18th and 19th. If you're listening to this when the show posts, if it's after the fact, just check out bettermanconference.com to find out more about what happened at the conference or other things that Ray's doing, because you got so much good stuff going on all the time, Ray. And listen, man, I mean, I love you as a brother and as a friend and as a mentor, and I'm just super grateful that you're out in the world doing what you're doing. And I love that you and Jennifer have partnered up on this Better Together conference, because I think it's super important. So thanks for what you're doing, and thanks for coming on to chat with me again and everyone here on the show.
Right back at you, Mike. Appreciate it.